Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Hoggard. I'm a journalist who has been covering the intersection of youth culture, popular culture, and life in the digital age for nearly 2 decades. I am very grateful to be moderating this session on the negative impact of social media on boys and young men. Though I wrote a piece for the New York Times investigating how a social media diet of perfect bodies is spurring some young men to form muscle dysmorphia not too long ago, this critical topic often remains underreported and ignored by the mainstream, a fact that makes the insight and expertise from the group of experts we're going to hear from momentarily all the more valuable. So while there has been an increased public awareness about how social media can be harmful to teenagers, much of that focus has been on girls. Recent reports, however, have found that these same online pressures can also cause teenage boys to feel bad about themselves, thanks to an algorithmic business model that maximizes engagement with harmful and extreme content for profit, which can lead to everything from sextortation, muscle dysmorphia, or bigorexia, mental health challenges, and more. Today, we are joined by a panel of experts who have focused on this topic from a range of perspectives. Imran Ahmed, CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, a British organization with offices in London and Washington, D.C., that works to stop the spread of online hate speech and disinformation. Tanasi Delos, a co-founder of Civics Unplugged, a nonpartisan social enterprise that trains and funds young civic innovators across the globe. And Dr. Mitch Prinstein, Chief Science Officer of the American Psychological Association. So first, I wanted to start with just some general questions, open it up to the floor. Feel free to answer as you guys see fit. So how do the harms social media poses to boys and young men differ from those experienced by girls? What unique challenges do boys face in the digital landscape?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. Some of the interesting findings that have been coming out in the scientific literature indicate that actually there are not as many gender differences as one would expect. So, in other words, a lot of what we've been focusing on with girls, boys are also experiencing those similar harms. They are also experiencing significant digital stress where they feel an incredible pressure to have to respond to all the notifications and stay online. Um, One of the things that's particularly interesting is that the culture, the social culture for those identified at birth as male versus female, um, differs to some extent. So there's actually some data suggesting that digital stress may affect boys more than girls. In other words, while girls might have the expectation of having ongoing close contact with friends in friendship diets, for instance, boys are not used to that kind of level of ongoing commitment and pressure as often. So the findings in the literature suggesting that these notifications and FOMO and constant need to reply to folks online might actually be affecting boys more because this is a new level of expectation and pressure to stay connected that they're not used to. I'll also just briefly mention that some of the work that's been talked about with social comparison is particularly relevant for some boys as well, because although the societal pressures towards females, towards body shape and idealized body types is certainly greater than that towards males, there's a lot of research demonstrating that some boys are experiencing tremendous pressure towards ideals of lean muscularity. And that is incredibly relevant because social media is often used to demonstrate one's either physique or success in being able to lift certain amounts of weights or things like that. So there's a few issues that are very unique to boys and important to pay attention to.
The one thing that we've been looking at, and completely agree with everything Dr. Princey just said, is radicalization and kind of on-ramps to extreme political and social beliefs that young men face online, specifically young men who have not yet been exposed to super culturally or politically diverse spaces in real life. They are pressured into feelings of hypermasculinity, not only in the way they present their physique or their physical appearance, but in the way they present their apathy towards certain ideals in culture, apathy towards diversity, kind of this like focus on being a man, this idea of traditionalism, and you hear these terms thrown around on the internet like tradwifery and being a traditional man. And we've seen, I think, all the way since 2016, this really focused on-ramp for young men into specifically far-right radicalization. We call them rabbit holes, but you can think of them as cesspools as well. And there are creators and people on the internet that are using the algorithms and leveraging a lot of the randomized experiences that young people have to force young men into these rabbit holes.
Hi, if I could talk about one of the differences and then I'll talk about one of the similarities. So we've done studies looking at both what social media content is served up to young girls and to young men. Let me give you two studies that we've done. One study of Deadly by Design, we looked at TikTok and what it serves up to a new 13-year-old girl's account. The TikTok had no other information beyond that they were 13 years old and it was a girl. And we did it in 4 different countries using VPNs, so they couldn't tell where they thought we were from those countries. We found that when we recorded the first half hour of the For You page, the algorithmically generated content page where it starts to serve you videos, seeing what you might be interested in and guessing based on your age and gender. Within 2.6 minutes of opening an account as a 13-year-old girl in these 4 countries, TikTok was serving self-harm content. Within 8 minutes, eating disorder content, so pro-anorexia, pro-ana content, every 39 seconds on average. Now, what's really interesting is that we then did a subsequent couple of studies. One study looked at Andrew Tate in particular, a manosphere influencer. That's the polite way of putting it. He's a real piece of work, we found that within 2.5 minutes of opening an account as a young boy, they were getting served Andrew Tate content. And we did a subsequent study called Toxic Trade, which looked at the ways in which young men are being served up content about steroids, telling them that to be a real man, you've got to be physically enormous. You've got to be massive like Captain America. That physique is unachievable, they say, without steroids and peptides and SARMs. And so you should start thinking about taking steroids. Then those people, those influencers, they have web stores where they will sell you those steroids and make sure they come to your home. And then they tell kids how to conceal that from their parents. Now, what's really interesting to me about both of those is that underlying both of them is a deeply desiccated misogynist view of the world in which men are there to physically be powerful and to dominate weak, skinny women. And, underfed women, they're telling girls to have a 700 calorie a day diet. That's lethal. And they're telling young men that you've got to be physically powerful, taking drugs, for example, anabolic steroids that can cause cardiac disorders, can cause some really serious problems. But nevertheless, there's this deeply desiccated view. And of course, that does, as Thanasi said, lead into some of those sort of those interesting intersecting organizations. I mean, you can almost call them the intersectionality of extremisms, where you have far-right extremism, neo-Nazi, white supremacist extremism, and male supremacist ideologies combining in groups like the Proud Boys, which are proudly say they are Western male chauvinist groups, right? And you see those hybrid organizations that then funnel people through into much more dangerous rabbit holes.
And what's always pretty astonishing to me is how easy this kind of chain effect, domino effect happens. Because think about when you're on Instagram and then you're served a t-shirt and you click buy, and next thing you know, you have a $20, $25 t-shirt showing up at your house. Well, if you're 13 and you're looking up to your favorite influencer, maybe you go on Reddit and check a message board that's about that influencer. That leads you to buy supplements, that leads you to buy steroids, that then gets put in the algorithm. It's quite easy to get stuck in this web. I'm curious what experience you guys have with what age are you seeing this starting with men? I know in my reporting, with some of the more shocking parts were kind of how young a lot of the men I spoke to said they first started kind of feeling harm from social media. My editors, 2 boys I talked to, one was 9, was when they said they started, and one was 7. my editors really struggled with, can we verify that? And it was a bit of a, it was difficult to, I think, process kind of how young that is. I'm curious what you guys, what experience you guys have of growing up in this environment.
Yeah, so we want to think, oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
You first.
I was just going to say, if we think about this in the context of pubertal development, right? So we're talking about the time at around 11, 12, when usually puberty is starts for boys about a year later than it does for girls. So this is where we're starting to get a big focus on the things that are valued within society. For girls, a lot of the physical changes that are happening to the body are moving girls' body shapes away from the unrealistic norms, right? That folks have for females, but for boys, it's the changes are usually moving towards more dominance, right? Taller, deeper voices, bigger sizes. And for that reason, there's kind of from the very beginning of puberty a push to really maximize that experience. So as you're saying, kids as young as 10 or 11 can, boys can start to be concerned about whether they're capturing that thin muscularity ideal. And because those images are so easily present online, just as they are of idealized females for young girls, there's really that pressure to push kids towards that content. And this is stuff that's happening, as has been said, by other actors who are pushing content to make a profit, but there's also the norms of peers just posting their own selfies or their own workout routines online, and there are influencers who are of particular body shapes to really be those idealized images. And that's starting to affect kids at the exact time that we're handing them these devices and giving them, in some cases, unfettered access. So it's really important to recognize what you're potentially opening boys up to.
I think I can speak from experience here on this one. Two things. First is I've experienced the bigorexia firsthand. I remember in 2019, 2020, I was a senior in high school, and I was sitting there eating spoonfuls of peanut butter and trying to hit these 5,000 calorie, like goals and watching workout videos. And I wasn't someone, I played baseball when I was in high school, but I didn't want to lift all the time. But suddenly everywhere I looked was content about lifting and getting big and looking good. And I was like, oh, it like incepted me into wanting to live this lifestyle. And it was really bad. And thankfully I pulled up out of that, much thanks to a lot of people I interacted with in a professional setting. But I think throughout life, I've kind of been the target of a lot of this. I'm a, middle class white male, no college degree, played a lot of video games. And so growing up, I remember just being flooded in 2016, 2015 with content about Milo Yiannopoulos, with content about the far right and about the Proud Boys, and how much time I spent on the internet, and how everywhere I looked, no matter what I tried, like even my YouTube suggested feed would be that type of content. And so it wasn't that I was going out and looking for that, but that was the only thing I could see. And so you talk to kids now that are 10, 11, even younger, they don't have the opportunity to look up to someone that is a teenager, even that is not ultra projecting this like very radical view of what it means to be a man. And it's really affecting them. I'll give one example. There's a Twitch streamer called Sneeko, and he is one of these, Andrew Tate-esque type people. There's a video out there that happened a couple months ago where 3 young boys, couldn't be older than 10 years old, ran up to him at a Dodgers game, at a baseball game, and said, like, they went to go take a selfie. And as they were taking a selfie, the young boys said, excuse my language, like, fuck women, we hate women, like, women are bitches. And it was like, holy crap, these young boys have only been able to see men like this as role models. Like, they're the most crucial points of their development have been influenced by this type of content. And they're going to spend another 6 or 7 years taking in that content before anyone does anything about it. I was there for maybe a year or two. I was there just for the beginning. There are young boys right now that are growing up that will have 10 years of this content every single day, everywhere they look. We don't even know what that will do to affect their psyche. So I think, it's not just that we're starting younger, it's that we're not doing anything to stop it until they hit 20 or 21 when we're actually talking to them about it.
So if I can just add a very short point from my experience working on the justice brief when I worked in politics, but the primary ages of criminogenicity, so the first years of first time offending, are 14 to 24, which conforms with the transition to adulthood. This really important part in our development where we're not being socialized by our parents the first 14 years. We're not being socialized by partners 24, around, that's what the mean was at the time onwards. But it's that bit where we're being socialized by each other. There's intense peer group pressure. And that's the ages at which we're seeing the sort of first time criminal offending, but also it's the ages at which people are particularly vulnerable to this kind of hyper acceleration of their sense of positional, of where they stand in society, how they compare to others, how they can make themselves into a person from a child into an adult who a woman might want to spend their life with or spend time with. And I think those years are particularly vulnerable. And so I'm not just thinking about the younger ages, I'm also thinking, well, actually, this reaches through to 24. And that carries through in the data. The modal age, so the age at which you have the highest percentage of people who have eating disorders is 21, right? It's not 17-year-olds, it's not 16-year-olds, it's 21. Because these positional sort of, these pressures accrue over time, and we see that 21 is this particularly particularly sort of high level of eating disorders in young women. So I just want to sort of say it's not just the young age, it's also sort of slightly above into adulthood as well. And it's why when we come up with solutions, we can't just think about kids, we have to think about those young adults as well.
And frankly, it even extends into your 30s, which is like a whole other untapped.
Your 40s, yes.
Yeah. Something that I thought was that Tanasi brought up that I think is worth highlighting is just the role YouTube plays, especially on young boys and young people in general. Is that because maybe if you're a parent, you might think, well, I'm not going to give an Instagram account to my 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old yet, whatever age is the appropriate age you get an Instagram. But YouTube is really like, you don't think about it very much. It's kind of like watching TV, and maybe kids are watching cartoons, but next thing you know, the YouTube algorithm is extremely aggressive. I mean, whenever I'm doing a story and I'm using YouTube for research, my entire experience is filtered for the next 3 months. So I'll be fed like just crazy images, and I can only imagine being so young. But Dr. Prinstein, I wanted to ask you as well, this kind of psychological relationship, I think the algorithm trains all of our brains, let alone young forming brains, to associate validation and existence with recording it and posting it online, and kind of treating everything from gym gains to what you eat for breakfast to being bored at school as content. What have you found about those habits, and is there any kind of means to sort of help kind of break that, or is it possible, or what's your take on kind of those habits?
Yeah, so what we know now from the scientific literature is that what we see online is changing the way that our brain responds to images. So when you see an image in real life, it doesn't come with an icon indicating how many people agree with it or like it. But when you see that image online, it often does. And studies have demonstrated that seeing images with or without that like count attached to it changes which part of the brain is responding to that image. Specifically, when you see things that are illegal or immoral or dangerous, presumably that could include things like seeing someone inject steroids, or usually you would see some activation of the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain's brakes, kind of telling us, you shouldn't do that. You should be careful and stop your impulses. But when you see that same image with likes attached to it, there's no activation of the prefrontal cortex. So there's no brakes. And that's very concerning, because when we're fed many of these images, it creates what we would call a social norm, or a sense of which we start thinking this is normal, this is what's typical, and this is what we're supposed to think, feel, believe, and act on. I'll just mention really briefly, especially with the example you're giving on YouTube, Alex, is that was once the case that there were action figures for things like Luke Skywalker and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and when they first came out, they depicted kind of regular healthy body shapes. And a few years later, the exact same Luke Skywalker and Han Solo kind of action figures looked incredibly kind of muscled up, more of a He-Man physique than an actual, human. And what happened is that groups came in and said, stop, you should sell these figures to look like they do in the movies, which are like regular healthy body shapes, not these kind of jacked up, images instead. And that was good. It was good that people fought back and said, stop coming out with these action figures. You're sending the wrong message to young kids. There's no one doing that on social media. There's no way to stop those images. And so what's happening is we're not only normalizing those as the images and idolizing those body shapes now, but now it's attached to likes. So it's also changing the way that the brain is responding to those images when they see them.
Imran, I'm curious, you've looked at TikTok and AI and kind of how those technologies can end up exploiting or taking advantage of vulnerabilities as well. Can you kind of walk us through what you found?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a couple of examples. I mean, I think the one would be in that study that I mentioned, Deadly by Design, where we set up accounts as 13-year-old girls in 4 different countries, the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, and recorded the first half hour of what they fed to us. We set up half the accounts with names like a girl's name like Susan. We set up another half of the accounts with a name like Susan Lose Weight. So there's research showing that when kids do have issues or mental health problems or body dysmorphia, that they will put it in their bios, they will put it in their username. So we wanted to indicate vulnerability in that, only that way. Those accounts got 12 times as much self-harm content in the first half hour as the normal accounts. Now, what that tells you is that rather than what anyone listening here today or on this panel would do, if you met a 13-year-old girl who told you that she thought she was too skinny and she wanted to know how to go on a 700 calorie a day diet, you would say to her, you'd know that you've got to be cautious, right? You've got to be careful because this child might be vulnerable. The TikTok algorithm, which is not a human being, is programmed by a human being who didn't care about the guardrails on it. But it's not a human being says, I found the way to hook this person, because it has trillions and trillions of data points telling it what actually addicts people who have those sorts of profiles. So that's one example. Another example is a study that we did called Malgorithm. So this is way back during the pandemic. We wanted to do a study seeing how cross-fertilization of extremisms happens. Essentially, how when someone believes one conspiracy theory, what's driving them to the next conspiracy theory, something that might be completely disconnected and abstruse, but nevertheless, they're being drawn into. What we found is that if you are on Instagram and you start liking accounts which were anti-vax or COVID denial, Instagram would recommend you anti-Semitic and QAnon accounts. And vice versa. If you liked QAnon and anti-Semitic accounts, it would give you COVID. So what the algorithm recognizes, again, based on trillions of data points, is a simple sort of psychological truth, which is that people with high levels of epistemic anxiety, that is, they're a desperate need for closure, for certainty, not knowing how to get the information, not knowing what's true or not. They're more prone to believing conspiracy theories, but the problem is that conspiracy theories, because they're theories, they're not facts, they never sate that epistemic anxiety, so they look for more and more and more to fill the hole. They're like junk food information. You can have a Big Mac and then you want another one because you're still hungry. So what people do is what we see from the external is rabbit hole, but actually what they're doing is quite internally consistent with their psychological state, this desperate yearning for closure and an inability to work out how exactly they can get that closure. So, I mean, we see again and again that these mechanisms are reoccurring in different platforms. And just to make the point on YouTube, I mean, YouTube's owned by Google. I've never met a company that is so efficient at gaslighting people into pretending that it's doing the right thing. I mean, X sues you, Facebook ignores you, TikTok panics and starts running around and doing crazy stuff and telling everyone that it's actually, trying its very hardest, and Google just gaslights you. And that's been our sort of the pattern of behavior when we've dealt with the companies themselves, which is in part why we publish all our research publicly so that people can decide for themselves.
I think a kind of byproduct or subtext to everything you just said is also the amount of time all this takes up in young boys' lives. So if you're falling down rabbit holes, obsessing over content, obsessing over likes, obsessing over fitness, obsessing over message boards, obsessing over whatever it is, you end up also being isolated. Or you're missing family dinners, you're missing birthday parties with friends, you're not being included in things anymore because you're so caught up in these communities online. And I think that sort of isolation ends up then just throwing gasoline on all those topics you just mentioned.
And that's money. That's dollar bills, because every minute that you spend on that platform, they're serving you another ad. And of course, that's exactly what they're aiming to do. They're trying to get you hooked into content that puts you in these these looping patterns of looking for more and more and more information. Where do you find conspiracy theories? You don't find it on NBC. You don't really find it in books. You find it on their platforms, captive market.
Yeah. I mean, Tanasi, I'm curious if you could speak to what you see going on right now. Are there any kind of concerning shifts or promising shifts in the digital space?
I mean, we've focused on the concerning, so maybe I can shed some promising lights here. I think the one thing that we know is that young people are not completely ignorant to the challenges of social media. I think you often, if you sit down with someone of any age that we can say, like, let's say under 25, they'll tell you that they are addicted to doom scrolling. They'll make jokes about how they need to go outside and touch grass, or how they need to, turn off their phones. But the problem is that they can't. The problem is that, everywhere they look, unlike someone that was growing up without the internet, the grass, you could always imagine the grass is greener. Even if you were having a bad time in your personal life, you can always imagine, it'll get better. There's something else out there. Now, a lot of young people, what we're hearing from the people we're talking to, is that they see the entire world. All the lights are on, and it doesn't look like it's getting better. And so that's really unfortunate. But at least, there's a recognition of the problem, which means that we could take another step into the solution. And, I think, Imran, back to something that you were saying, I don't think that the algorithm needs to be seen as something that needs to be nuked and destroyed. It can also be seen as something we can leverage to make positive impact. There's this trend on TikTok called Hopecore, where it is like people who are posting on TikTok kind of confronting all of this really damaging, depressing information, or all this radicalizing information, and saying, like, it's just videos with beautiful sound behind it of like things that should make you smile. It could be like a baby laughing. It could be your favorite like NBA superstar, like winning a playoff game or whatever. And people in the comments are loving this type of content. It is making them feel very happy. And so the algorithms aren't suppressing that. The algorithms are seeing that people are liking it, and they're pushing it to more people, which shows to me that there is still a glimmer of hope, that young people want to feel good on the internet, and they can feel good on the internet. There was also a question that I saw about, where the positive words and spheres. I don't have the terminology. I don't know if there are, but there are communities on the internet where young men specifically feel very welcomed and feel like they are exploring new passions. I think there are, just like everywhere on the internet, that's the beauty of it. You know what I mean? You can go on these subreddits and you can learn about how to, build Legos or play video games or do math or do computer science. You can, share your feelings about your college admissions process, which is also a very, emotionally harming thing for young people, with other young people that you will never actually see in real life, but you'll be able to kind of share that struggle with. And so, at least when we talk about it at Civics Unplugged, but kind of throughout my life, the internet and the algorithms are not inherently evil, at least in my mind, and I'm okay with people that disagree. But I think that truly, like, there's a leverage point here that young people can take hold of and create more spaces like this where they can have hope, where they can feel really good. Because if we don't do that, then we will not pull up out of the death spiral quick enough. I think we'll lose millions more young people over the course of the next couple of years.
I really, really appreciated that, and if I can, however, push back a little bit. So I agree that algorithms are equations. Equations don't have feelings. They don't have. You can't ascribe morality to an equation. But I think that the people that have built those equations haven't thought about sufficient guardrails to ensure that they aren't doing the wrong thing. And that's one of the issues there. And second, they haven't curated the information that's fed into those algorithms to then output. They hyper accelerate conspiracism. And here's my concern is that yes, young people understand social media platforms better, but they have lower resilience to conspiracy theories because they have a lower level of knowledge, full stop. And that's borne out in the statistics that we're seeing. So we did polling last year looking at 9 conspiracy theories. We asked 14 to 17-year-olds in America and the UK, and we asked adults in America and the UK. This is the numbers for the US. So of those 9 conspiracy theories, 49% of adults agreed with 4 or more of those conspiracy theories in the US, 60% of 13 to 17-year-olds, and 69% of 13 to 17-year-olds who use social media extensively. When you have a statement like, Jewish people exert disproportionate control over the economy and our politics, 34% of adults, 43% of 14 to 17-year-olds, 54% of high use 14 to 17-year-olds. And that's really disturbing. The macro trends are actually not good. They're actually really quite disturbing. And while there is lots of content out there, and I wish it could be seen by everyone, the problem is that it's not getting to sufficient people because it's not being rewarded by the algorithm in the same way.
Completely agree with you. I think that, to bring my specific comment back, there's a bill in front of the Senate right now that's trying to ban algorithmic recommendation systems for folks that aren't. And I think, again, a lot of what we're hearing from the young people we work with, and these are kids from middle school all the way to college in the United States. And again, this is very anecdotal. We don't have any large-scale studies, but it is extremely concerning to them because the algorithms are also the things that will power most of our lives, even outside of social media. They're something that young people should grow to understand and have interactions with. And so I completely agree with you that they need to be regulated. They need to be cleaned. They need to be completely rebuilt. So it's not, 40 MIT PhDs against one teenage boy or teenage girl. But I think that, completely writing them off, like some folks, specifically in the United States, are trying to do, is more harmful because it doesn't give people, as they're growing up, the ability to interact and understand these systems so that when they do turn 18 and they are legalized again, it's not like, alcohol or cigarettes where we are just dumping them into the deep end without having any sort of education. It's a larger conversation about how we have that education and build that into their lives as they grow up. And again, this is just my personal view as I was birthed on Reddit and on all these, so I have a biased opinion, but yeah, I completely agree with your framing of the current problem.
I would just add from a perspective on the adolescent brain that, we know for sure that most 10, 11, 12-year-olds do not have the cognitive capacity to decide yet whether everything that they post should become data that are used for others. To understand the long-term consequences of that, to even remember that 6 months later when they're posting something else and say, oh yeah, that thing that I signed when I first joined, and to remember that. Those are usually not written in child-friendly ways anyway, but even if they were, a 10, 11, 12-year-old is not able to make the decision about how their data should be used. We also know that a 10, 11, 12-year-old is not able to resist the pull for ongoing engagement that the algorithms, can push. They don't yet have the part of the brain fully developed that allows them to inhibit their impulses. Now, that all develops over time, of course, and some kids may have that competence more than others. But just as a biological kind of fact, we know that the majority of kids at that age aren't equipped to interact with a platform that was designed for adult decision making. I agree with everything that's been said, but I think that piece of it, though, we need to figure out how to protect children who are unable to make those decisions for themselves in a way that I don't think that currently the platforms have kind of accounted for.
Something that I think I'm still grappling with and don't quite have an answer for, but really strikes me. So I'm 39 and I technically grew up before social media and even the internet. But for young kids who grew up as, to not say like on Reddit, there there is no outside of that. Like there's no concept, there's no taking that away of taking away a huge part of how they come to socialize and see themselves. So it's difficult for them to, I don't know, it's hard for me to, I think it's just to get into that mindset of like, I think when sometimes I try and think of like, well, I can put that away. But for a lot of young people, that's really so socialized into their existence that I'm not really sure. Yeah, the regulation strategy is difficult, I think, or at least there's a generational divide. Do you guys see kind of conversations, any tensions between how young people think of their existence online and how older people do?
Yeah, well, as an old person, I can tell you, we're hearing a lot of that. So in the literature, what we're hearing are things like, yeah, I'm totally addicted to these platforms. I 100% understand it, but it's like being addicted to caffeine. Who cares? It doesn't really have any consequence. So one issue is to talk about, is it having a consequence? Is it affecting kids' mood? Is it affecting their brain development, the size of their brain development, the functioning of their brains? That's one issue. But the second is, as you're saying, that people equate their platforms with the totality of their social interactions. So if you take it away, are you saying it's bad to interact with people socially? Are you saying it's bad to interact with my friends? If it's gone, I would have no other way to interact with my friends. So there's a little bit of a conflation of, is this it is the primary vehicle for social interactions. And if you take it away, what happens to all the rest of the social interactions? Not to be the old geezer on the panel, but we did used to have social interactions without social media. There were some negatives to it, especially if you're in rural areas or, but there are ways. So I think what we're really talking about is more moderation, how to use it to supplement rather than completely replace social interactions, and how to use it in the best possible ways. So you're getting all the benefits from it and you're not getting exposure to some of those harms. And I think that's important because I don't think there's a world in which this all just goes away forever. I think we're living with social media forever. So how do we help kids to use it to supplement and enhance what they're able to develop in real life?
I was in Oakland, California a few weeks ago, and I met with Arturo Bejar, the whistleblower who was one of the earliest people at Meta, Facebook. And he came forward as a whistleblower recently, revealing an internal beef study, which was a study of negative experiences by young people on social media platforms, on their social media platforms, on Instagram in particular. And he had dozens of recommendations for small and large things that could be done to improve the user experience for young people, to give them more control, to give them more, to make the platform less potentially toxic for them. And when he sent that to Mark Zuckerberg and Adam Mosseri and others, they shelved it. They said, no, we're going to ignore this. And I think that, yes, it's all very nice saying the small things platforms could do, but they've decided not to. It actually loses them money to make those platforms less sticky and addictive. And at the moment, we have no way of holding them accountable. We lack transparency in these platforms. We're currently being sued at CCDH by Elon Musk for having the temerity to research his platform. Laura Edelson was threatened by Meta for 2 years with a lawsuit. TikTok is making their platform less opaque, taking out view numbers for hashtags. We see these platforms becoming. I had a bizarre conversation with Google the other day where I asked them what their rules were on a certain type of content, and they said we can't tell you because if we did, people would work out how to skirt the rules, which is bizarre. That they've got rules, but they won't tell you what they are. So they're becoming more and more opaque, less transparent. We need that transparency. of algorithms, of their enforcement policy, of their economics, their advertising, what's advertising and how's that changing the user experience, so that we can have meaningful accountability. We've all seen some terrible, terrible hearings in Congress. I've seen them in Parliament in the UK, in the EU, in Congress, in Canada. They're not very good because they don't have the information. They don't have objective facts. And those executives are able to slide under by saying, you don't know the real data, only we do, and we're not telling you. And that can lead to, I think that will lead to a position where we might be able to hold these companies responsible. And I am a great advocate of reforming Section 230, so that when companies have been genuinely negligent, and that's, bringing them into negligence law, the same as any other company in America, that they can be held accountable through the courts if they cause harm to people, and there is genuine gross negligence. I think that's a really, really, it is possible to hold these companies accountable, but at the moment we're being too piecemeal about it. We're thinking, well, let's sell TikTok to an American company, let's do this, let's do that. And actually what you need is a framework that allows us to have a transparent, open, energized, helpful discourse about how these companies are run and whether or not that serves the public good.
Tanas, I'm curious if you mentioned the Senate bill. Are there other examples of policymakers or people who work at some of these companies that you've encountered that you think is doing good or, I guess, bad work on this topic?
Yeah. I mean, I think that most of the work that the U.S. Congress has done is admirable. I think that the TikTok ban is politically a questionable choice, and also just attention and energy wise a questionable choice. It's to kind of the question of like, how do young people feel about this regulation? I think that nothing has activated people to think about who their local representative is more than this TikTok ban, which is scary as hell. We do a lot of get out the vote work, and we're focused on how do we activate non-voters in swing states this year. I have literally never seen a greater volume of young people asking and contacting their representatives for the first time outside of TikTok gave them a notification that TikTok's getting banned. So there is this desperate want to keep these platforms. And it is, I think it's very easy for us that kind of have this wider context to say, well, if we really scale it back and if we really roll it back, there will be other ways to socialize. And that is true. But in the short term, for a lot of these people, it does feel like you're cutting off their lifeline, like you're cutting off any semblance of personality, of expression that they ever had, because they don't feel like they have it in real life. And that's another problem. There's a larger issue here for young men and young women where, the world is really pushing down on them. They don't feel like current systems, education systems, economic systems are serving them properly. They feel like a lot of people aren't listening to them. And so all this is manifesting on social media because the volume is louder, but we shouldn't make a mistake and say that it's just all because of social media. These are all symptoms. But I do think there has been meaningful engagement around regulation and making platforms more transparent and more accountable. I think a lot of young people, I would argue most of young people, no matter their political ideology, can agree that the opaque nature of the way these platforms handle their data and the way they sell a lot of young people's data is something that people want to stop. But I think a lot of people view these sweeping bans, I know there's a question about bans too that we can get to, as completely, look over there, let's just do something that looks really powerful but doesn't actually help us. It actually hurts young people more. It kind of reaffirms to them that their government isn't listening to them. I think it's actually a huge negative, and pushes the constituency of young people much farther away from the conversation of regulation that we need them at the table for.
Let me just plus one a few of those points because they're very much supported by the research. There are many kids out there who are experiencing a remarkable amount of minority stress. The experience of being a racial, ethnic, sexual, gender minoritized individual, especially when, political leaders are disparaging, those identities or their contributions to society. It's very, very real. And it is very much the reason why we're seeing such increasing rates of suicidality within those populations and youth mental health concerns. Social media does provide an outlet for kids to find a group of folks who share in their identity, to get information that they need and to get social support for that experience. That's really important. And I think that all out, all or nothing solutions have the potential to cause harm by, ripping away those really critical support systems. I think it's really important to consider what parts of social media do we need to salvage those really important pieces, right? Do we need kids to be on for, longer than they wish to be on? So they're reporting, I can't stop myself, even when I try. Probably not. I think you can get the benefit without them feeling so hooked in that they can't stop themselves. Should they be able to access that information without cyber hate and discrimination also being shown to them? Of course, we should create a space where they're not being bullied online, which is ironically also targeting underrepresented folks. So I think that there could be a way to create a version of this that salvages what we know can be helpful, but takes away those things that are hurtful. The problem is some of the things that prove to be the most harmful happen to be the things that increase engagement / profit. So what is the motivation to change the experience? And are we doing it in a way that's best for youth well-being or that's best for profit?
But that's a classic example of a market and regulatory failure. I mean, that is a textbook definition of a market and regulatory failure, where the negative externalities of an industry, where the harms created by an industry that are imposed outside of that industry are actually quite significant. And typically what you do is you force them to share in the costs of those externalities, of those harms that they cause. And you do that through, in the US in particular, I mean, I'm British, but I live in America, I live in DC. When I moved there, I realized that when you've got a problem with a cup of coffee, you sue someone. And, typically you do that through the litigation system. But we can't. We can't hold those companies accountable through the litigation system. And that is a major problem because of a law passed in 1996 that basically says you've got to get a jail-free card for anything. And the truth is we have no meaningful method of changing the simple economic fact that if they do nothing, there's no cost. And if they do something, they have to take an action that's costly, and they may have to reduce the amount of stickiness or the amount of content, which is also costly. And so there's a double hit there, bottom line, if they do something about it, and zero hit if they do nothing. And that is bananas. You will never fix that system. People keep saying they need to fix their business model. Mark Zuckerberg made $100 billion before he was 40. I'm 45, so much younger than I am even now. And that is a great business model, probably the greatest business model in my lifetime. Why would he change it? Why? Unless we create those costs. And we do that in part at CCDH through talking to advertisers, and advertisers take money away if they feel that this is really, really contravening their morals. But also, we've been pushing for regulation and legislation so that they can share in those costs all around the world. We've achieved that in the UK, the EU, Canada's now legislating, Australia, New Zealand have got legislation. It's the US that has quite the opposite. It has anti-legislation. It says, no, these are special companies that are completely and utterly impossible to hold accountable.
I want to open it up to some audience questions. One question that I think is related to what we've all just been discussing is the question of what do the three of you make of recent calls to ban smartphones for people under 16? Do you guys see that as a solution, or is it a distraction to put pressure on tech companies?
I do think that it's important to recognize that the harms that are built into some of the features and content in social media, they do not go away at the age of 16. So it is absolutely critical that we remain focused on how the platforms can change the features, the content, and the disbursement of AI recommendations in a way that keeps everyone safe. We can't fix that by just having kids not use it until they're 16. We have to, if this is a both and solution, that's a different question. But at least we have to recognize that This cannot be an instead of. We also must change these platforms to reduce harm.
Yeah, I just maybe a funny thing to our friend in the UK here. Kids my age, I'm 21. I just turned 21. Had my first drink like 3 months ago, and I the ban of alcohol and the complete like regulation of a bunch of things throughout history of the United States have just caused young people to run to them faster and hide them from parents and have a less transparent conversation with adults in their lives about harms, about successes, about real use. And so when we talk about something like technology and like the internet, banning it until someone turns 16 not only harms them in the short term and makes them hide this use and makes them more prone to sneaking around and using it for really bad things, it also really stops their potential financial success later in life, their performance in the job market, their performance in school. This isn't something that is only bad, that's only being used for recreational purposes. People use the internet to succeed in life. And so if we're banning smartphones and we're putting such a cap on these technologies, you're telling young people that they can't use them to get ahead in life. They can't use them in their professional lives, which is extremely harmful.
I mean, to make the point that the age of being able to have a pint in the a beer, you'd call it, in the UK is 18, and I did not wait till I was 18 to have a pint. I mean, I used to sneak out of my parents' house. My parents are Muslims, and I would sneak out and have a pint with my mates all the time when I was 15, 16, 17. Yeah, that's just what we did. And you can always, kids always find a way around. And it's why I really agree with Thanasi here that this is about actually if when kids have those phones, it's when you feel that your kid is mature enough to be able to have it, and that's an individual decision you negotiate with your child. But we've got a website up, protectingkidsonline.org, where we have a parents guide which is very short and basically is themed around the idea that the way that you help your kid to navigate social media is to get rid of this shame of saying, well, that kids are seeing content which is being served to them. It's not their fault it's being served to them, but where they can talk to you about it. So shame-free conversations from the beginning in which you're learning from them. It has to be a symmetrical conversation in which you're learning from them what they're seeing on those platforms, how those platforms work. And you're then able to help them to understand, to contextualize some of that information, to understand that something they're seeing frequently may not be normal, and actually that you can help them understand that. And that's one of the jobs of parents. My wife and I are having our first this year, and this is the advice that we're giving to ourselves, and it's the advice that we'd give to any other parent too, that this it's almost impossible to, and once you start encouraging deceitful behavior by putting arbitrary age limits on, I worry about what then about your ability then to have those open and really, really vital conversations throughout your child's life.
And I'll just add that even I don't know all the different ways you can access online today. I mean, you could have streaming Xbox, games, and God, now I just sound like an old man. But it's so beyond the phone. And I have in my reporting, I did speak to parents that tried to set up all these really diligent, thoughtful rules, and they go to soccer practice, and every other boy in the team has an iPhone in the locker room or whatever. I mean, it's so ubiquitous that I wouldn't. It's like whack-a-mole. Another question from the audience was was there any geographical data, or are these issues popping up in certain parts of the world or in the States in certain places and not? I will say in my reporting, I found that it was everywhere. I mean, it was small town British Columbia, it was affluent suburbs in New Jersey, it was downtown Manhattan, it was, and it was across racial and sort of other identity markers. I mean, to me, it felt like no one was necessarily able to kind of be exempt from this, although that's not to say everyone's affected the same. But I'm curious what you guys think.
We are lacking data on some regions of the planet, particularly in more rural or less developed countries, for sure. among the North American and European kind of countries where a lot of the research that I've seen has been conducted, there don't seem to be differences, kind of as you say, that have been too clear, consistent at all. So it does seem to be a thing that's affecting lots of kids in very similar ways, for sure. I do think that a lot of this is a concern because it's how the platforms are built, and it's when using the platforms as directed, right? So that's an issue. We are seeing some differences. So while there is discussion about limiting the phone or limiting the apps through the App Store, and there are similar concerns about that being insufficient. We do know that lots of kids can get access, of course, nevertheless. And, we are seeing that when you take kids away from some of these products, even randomized, take some kids away from it, they do show some improvements. So we're able to make causal statements by looking at that approach. And we're now seeing that in the Netherlands, France, Great Britain, we're seeing devices not be able to be used during class time or in school. We're seeing changes in, we know that in China, TikTok is very different in terms of how kids can use it as compared to how kids use TikTok here. If Chinese kids are being protected, then American kids should be too. So there are a lot of things geographically that we can learn from some of our other countries about some solutions.
Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. This panel ends at 11, but I will say there were so many more great questions that I wish we had got to. They're all questions that the four of us are thinking about, working on, have done research on, would like to hear more about, get insight on. So please feel free to reach out and ask those questions directly. I'm sure any one of us or all of us would be happy to answer. Thank you guys so much for chatting with me. And I'm really, my takeaway from this topic is that it just needs to be discussed more. I mean, before we can even get real answers, it just needs to be discussed, and it needs to be discussed across generations, age groups. It needs to be happening simultaneously. To me, there is a silence around this stuff happening with boys and men, and even men in adulthood. So thank you guys all for being so open and all the work you do.
Thank you, Alex. And just to say, like, your reporting has been amazing on bigorexia and other issues. So, yeah, the more power to you as well to get the message out there to as many parents as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.